Welcome to the people of Penn State, Caroline Fitzgerald.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Paul. Thank you for having me. I am excited to talk all things Penn State today and talk a little bit more about women's sports. So again, appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Let's start at the beginning there. How did you become a Penn State Nittany Lion?
Oh, so there is a real rich history of being a Nittany Lion in my family. Um, I am one of 8 kids, and all 8 of us, all 7 of my siblings attended Penn State. So I'm the third oldest in the family. The first got into Penn State, got into the Schreier Honors College, and attended, and just had such a wonderful experience that it just made sense that the rest of us would follow suit. So when it came my time to pick where I was going to be going to college, I was lucky enough to get into Penn State, and it just had everything that I wanted out of a college experience. I wanted the opportunity to play club basketball. I wanted the opportunity to have 2 interesting majors. I wanted to get involved with student organizations and have an athletics atmosphere. So, Penn State just really offered me everything that I was hoping for. And I certainly couldn't break the streak in my family. We had to go all 8 for 8 at Penn State.
Imagine the pressure on number 8.
Not kidding. But he lived up and he loved it. And, no complaints from anybody. We all had really different majors, really different experiences, but everybody absolutely loved their time in State College and Happy Valley.
When did the youngest graduate?
He graduated, I want to say 5 years ago.
5 years ago. Is it Jackson?
Yeah, Jackson.
Oh, all right. I know Jackson.
Oh my goodness. Yes, Jackson is the baby of the family. So Jackson.
Of all the Fitzgeralds I could have gotten here, I'm glad I got the right one.
Oh my gosh. Jackson is doing some really amazing work. He's a good kid. But yeah, me and Jackson, our Penn State experiences looked very different, but I think that's the beauty of Penn State, is that it can serve you in so many different ways.
Absolutely. So let's dive into some of those extracurricular reasons why you wanted to come to Penn State. What were you involved in as a student here?
Yeah, so I already mentioned I played on the women's club basketball team. So if you can probably see the basketballs in the background of my video, basketball has always been a really, really important part of my life. And so I didn't want to not play basketball in college, but I did want to go to a big university and have a well-rounded experience. So the club sports atmosphere really offered me an opportunity to keep playing at a pretty competitive level. So that was the first thing I signed up for when I came to campus, or tried out for, I should say, when I came to campus. I also worked for all 4 years at the Center for Women Students, which is now the Gender Equity Center at Penn State. That was a really, really foundational part of my experience at Penn State. I also was a line ambassador. I also served as a director at Thon. I was the merchandise director in 2011. I was a resident assistant. I was involved in the Triota Women's Studies Honor Society. So I'm probably forgetting a few things. I was really, really involved, and that's what I liked. I liked being able to go from a line ambassador tour to a basketball practice, and go from a Thon meeting to my being on duty as a resident assistant and almost being forced to stay in my dorm because I was so busy. But it was wonderful to be able to bop around and really take advantage of, again, everything that Penn State has to offer.
Absolutely. So, all right, shout out your Lion Ambassador Committee.
I was a Burroughs.
A Burroughs. Okay. Excellent.
Yes.
So when you came to Penn State, right, you graduated with a dual degree, right, in marketing, or 2 degrees in marketing and gender studies. What was the initial career goal?
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure what the goal was. I did know coming into Penn State, and I think I've known this throughout pretty much my entire life, that I wanted to do something at the intersection of sports and business and feminism. I had a really kind of defining moment as a 7-year-old baseball player. So just to tell a quick story, the first sport that I played was baseball. And when it came time for my parents to sign me up to play on my first baseball team, there weren't any girls' baseball teams in the neighborhood. So they just signed me and my brother up to play on the same boys' baseball team. And I remember showing up to our first game, and almost immediately the boys on the other team started teasing me and taunting our whole team because we had a girl on our team, and little kid stuff like girls can't play baseball, and just saying how they were going to crush us because we had a girl on our team. And I took that to heart. I couldn't believe that they were saying that we were going to be a worse team because I was on the team and I was a girl. And so I was really determined to prove those boys wrong. So we took the field in the inning. I was playing in the infield, and it just happens. Like, I couldn't have scripted this better. The first three boys on the other team all hit ground balls right to me, and I threw them out. It was like the fastest inning in the history of baseball. And I remember walking off the field that day with this feeling of, empowerment, and the thought that never again is someone going to tell me that I can't do something because I'm a girl, especially in sports. And I know it's 7 is pretty early to have, this revelation like that, but it really did put me on this path. And so going into college, back to your question, I did know I wanted to do something at that intersection around women's empowerment, sports, and business. But when I graduated from Penn State, which is 12 years ago now, there's not a super clear career path around that. So I just tried to set myself up to maybe one day do something. The only thing I could think of at the time was maybe I'd be the head of the women's department at Nike. So
Right.
that's kind of how I designed my majors. I got in first through the business college, and then to the liberal arts college, and added on women's studies. And then was able to really combine those two things through some of the work and research I did through the Schreier Honors College. So it wasn't super clear when I came in, but I did always have this kind of purpose planted in the back of my mind, and a hope that one day I would land at the intersection of those three passions.
This is the people of Penn State. I'm Paul Clifford. I'm joined by Caroline Fitzgerald. She's the CEO and founder of Goals. So I mentioned in your bio the diverse kind of background that you had leading up to the creation of Goals. Walk us through your career up to the time of starting Goals.
Yeah, so my career started with Kohl's department stores, and I am so proud of my time that I spent at Kohl's, and I was able to connect with the team at Kohl's through Penn State. I literally signed up for an interview for an internship through the Smeal Business College. And so I signed up for my interview, and I went in and I interviewed, and I was able to secure an internship with Kohl's. So Kohl's is where I really learned a lot of the foundational skills that I've taken with me throughout my entire career. It's where I learned how to prioritize customer service, large inventory management. It's where I learned how to be a marketer. So I started my career with Kohl's in Pittsburgh, and then I moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where they're headquartered, and worked in their marketing office, or their headquarters, on their marketing team, and worked on all the national campaigns that Kohl's did to drive traffic into their stores during big sales events. So think back to school or the week before Christmas, big holiday sales. So that's really where I learned how to practically be a marketer. So that was an incredible way to start my career. After that, while I was living in Wisconsin, I did miss being in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, and that's where my big family is pretty much all based. So I wanted to move home to Pittsburgh. And so I found a job working at the Smithsonian affiliated Heinz History Center, which was a marketing role. And I didn't really have working in a museum on my bingo card, but it offered a really, really interesting opportunity for me to create programs and events and campaigns that would drive a younger demographic into the History Museum. So I got to be really creative in that role. I got to work throughout the entire Pittsburgh community, and it was a really, really, really wonderful role. I'm still very much in touch with a lot of the people I worked with there. I'm now on the Champions Committee, which is the basically the board of the Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum, which is part of the Heinz History Center. So I'm still very much connected to the work that I did at the Heinz History Center. From there, I was, feeling that pull. I mentioned kind of that purpose at the intersection of sports and business and feminism. And as I got 5, 6 years into my career, I was feeling like I'm not exactly on that path that I hope to be on whenever I started at Penn State. So I started to look directly for positions in the sports world, and I found an opportunity to work at the Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon and P3R, which is the organization that puts on all the major running events that happen in the greater Pittsburgh area. So it wasn't exactly sports business and feminism, but I was back on that sports path. And so I worked for the Pittsburgh Marathon for almost 5 years in total. It was an incredible position. I loved it so much. I was the senior vice president of sponsorships there. So that was a different skill set than I had utilized in my previous 2 jobs, but I learned pretty quickly that selling sponsorships was really just developing marketing campaigns for the brands that you're bringing in to sponsor whatever event you're selling. So I found a real knack for it. I loved the work. It was while I was at the marathon that the global pandemic hit, and I was able to work from home. I was very privileged to be able to work from home the whole time. But I think like a lot of people during that time, I came back and I did a little soul searching. I had the thought, like, if we ever get out of this global crises, what do I want to be doing on the other side of this? And I came back to that thesis statement, if you will, of sports and business and feminism, and thought, I really want to be on that path. That feels like the thing that I should be doing. So at the time, I started consuming a lot more women's sports content, and something interesting happened when it comes to women's sports during the pandemic is that women's sports became more accessible than they ever had been before. And that's because, just given the nature of sports shutting down during the pandemic, broadcasters and networkers were really hungry for sports content. And women's sports leagues were some of the first to return to play during the global pandemic. So the WNBA, the NWSL, they were able to establish bubbles and bring their players safely back to compete. And so networks and broadcasters said, oh my goodness, like sports, we don't care if it's women, we'll put them on TV. So you were able to sit down and watch a WNBA season on TV all the way through, probably for the first time ever in history. So I was one of those people that sat down and watched that season, and I was really just blown away by what was happening in the women's sports industry. And I was noticing that in the industry in this moment, numbers were up and to the right. Viewership was up, sponsorship sales were up, merchandise sales were up. Like, something was clearly happening in women's sports. And I was like, I would love to learn more about this. So I love listening to podcasts like this one. And so I took to Spotify to see if I could find a podcast that talked about the business side of women's sports. And I couldn't even find one. And I thought that was a huge red flag in 2020, that there were no podcasts that talked about the business side of women's sports, when there were dozens, literally dozens, that talked about the business of men's sports. So maybe it was a bit self-serving. I really wanted to listen to a podcast about the business side of women's sports. So I thought, I'm going to start a podcast. I hadn't podcast before. I was like, I'm just going to try to figure this out, because I think this is something that this women's sports industry could use and could benefit from. So started a podcast, started the brand goals to market the podcast, because as a trained marketer, I knew that you can't just launch a podcast. You got to be able to market it to get people to listen to it. Otherwise, it's just going to be my family that tunes in. So I did that for about a whole year, podcasting and putting out content under the brand goals, while I was still working full time at the Dick's Sporting Goods Pittsburgh Marathon. And then after doing this for a year, I kind of convinced myself to go for it and get into the business of women's sports, and take my marketing background, take my sponsorship sales experience, take, all my life experience that I'd pulled to date, and create a business that would help demonstrate the economic and social value that comes with investing in women's sports. So around that time, I also went back to school and got my master's in global sport from NYU. So it all kind of came together, and then Goals was born.
That's an amazing origin story. What is the platform of the podcast been able to provide for you? I'm sure that you've had some some really interesting guests, right? Probably some people that you've always wanted to talk to, but without the platform of the podcast, you wouldn't have had the opportunity to.
Absolutely. I get to have the most fascinating conversations on a weekly basis. I had a conversation with Allison Felix, the most decorated American track and field athlete of all time, just yesterday. And I was pinching myself the whole time as I was having this conversation. I've just gotten to meet with some of the really most incredible and most brilliant minds in the sports industry. It's been incredible. And I'll say, this podcast has opened so many wonderful doors for me. And it's also opened a lot of doors across the women's sports industry. I hear a lot of feedback that our podcast has been the spark for economic development within the women's sports industry. People are able to connect, they're able to learn about what's happening over here in the women's sports industry, who's doing what work, what's working here, what's going on here. And it's really generated a lot of business and a lot of thought leadership in the space. And that makes me really proud to be able to help generate, more business, more transactions, more just, money coming into the women's sports industry. So that's really, really, really powerful and really important to me. And then I think just for me personally, beyond just getting to talk to so many amazing leaders in sports, but I don't think that I'd be able to have started a true business. So when I just had the podcast and the social channels for year one, it was not monetized. It was a side hustle, not even a side hustle. It was a side project. There was no money coming in. It was really coming out of my pocket to create this. But through the network, I was able to make through the podcast and the people I was able to connect with and the brand I was able to build and kind of get myself out there as somebody who knew what they were talking about in the women's sports space. I was then able to start a business and have that foundation in place that would allow me to go for it. And, I'm not a lifer in the women's sports industry. It's not like I've been here since I graduated from college. I was the new kid on the block when I came in. So the podcast really allowed me to establish my credibility, build my network, and then ultimately go fully into business with goals.
So since that time, though, you've become a leading voice in the business of women's sports and the topic of gender equity. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see in closing that gender gap in professional sports?
It's a really good question. So, first of all, I still think that there are a lot of outdated and antiquated ideas that exist around the product of women's sports and the viability of the women's sports industry. So, we still see a lot of comments on the internet. We still hear it in conversations with family members and friends that nobody cares about women's sports or nobody watches the WNBA. You hear these things all the time, or the WNBA isn't as exciting as the NBA because women can't dunk. Things like that. You hear these outdated ideas all the time. And my cat has joined the conversation. But I think that's a really big challenge is helping people understand that the product of women's sports is incredible. And I think the second biggest challenge, which leads right into that, is a lack of media coverage. So women's sports still receive just 5% of linear and traditional media coverage. The total share of the pie is 15%, and that jump from 5% to 15% comes from streaming, social media, emerging media. So, I think it's hard to debunk these myths about women's sports if we don't have the product of women's sports on TV, easily available for fans to see it and see for themselves that women's sports is absolutely incredible. So I think the lack of media coverage is really, really a big challenge. And then that leads into all the other challenges that we face in the space. If we don't have adequate media coverage and adequate access for fans to be able to come in and engage, we're not able to, bring in more brand partnership deals. And if we can't bring in more brand partnership deals, we're not able to bring in more revenue to pay athletes more. So I would say probably the biggest challenge is the lack of media coverage, which leads to a lot of other problems like those antiquated ideas still existing and then, trickling into the business side of women's sports.
So if I'm a CEO of a company, right, what are some actionable steps that I, as a company or other organizations, can take to better support women's sports and gender equity?
Yeah, I mean, I think some really low hanging fruit here is sponsoring women's sports. A lot of companies have men's sports sponsorship strategies that are part of their overall marketing campaigns. And the same isn't true for women's sports. So there was a report that came out the other day that just 6% of Fortune 500 companies are currently sponsoring professional women's sports. And across the globe, only 1% of total sports sponsorship dollars are going to women's sports. So that means 99% of sports sponsorship dollars are going to men's sports. So clearly businesses are seeing value in sponsoring men's sports. And women's sports are not that different than men's sports. Basketball is basketball. Sports are sports. So, if they're deriving value and they see that value in sponsoring men's sports, they should absolutely be seeing that value in women's sports. And there's a ton of data now to back up why companies are going to see incredible returns on investment for sponsoring women's sports. Fans of women's sports are incredibly loyal to brands that sponsor their favorite teams, leagues, and athletes because women's sports fans see their fandom as a form of activism. And when a brand comes in, they are so grateful that this brand is coming in and sponsoring their favorite team that they are going to then go do business with that brand. And there's a lot of data to back that up. So, there's a lot of power in that. Women's sports fans hold a lot of economic power when it comes to the brands that sponsor women's sports. And then we see a lot of data that talks about how women athletes perform better as influencers than a standard influencer or a male athlete. We see lots of data that talks about how, just in general, the numbers around women's sports are growing all the time. So if you think like with women's sports, you can't reach a big audience, that's actually not true. We are seeing records being broken every single day in women's sports. So if I was the CEO of a company, if you were the CEO of a company, I would say, start not just thinking about what you can do in women's sports, put your money down and start investing, start sponsoring women's sports because it is going to drive results for your business. And there's again, tons of data now to back that up.
So the only thing that I'll disagree with you on is that the comparison that men's basketball and women's basketball are the same thing. If you watch the NBA and the WNBA, it's totally different games. I actually would argue that the women's sport is a more pure form, a more technical form of the sport than the individualized game that you see with the dunks and the highlights that you see on TV, right? It's such an individual star-driven game on the NBA side. I actually prefer watching WNBA basketball.
You are not alone. There's a lot of folks out there that say that if you really care about the fundamentals of sport, basketball, soccer, whatever sport, hockey, whatever sport we're talking about, you're going to get that more on the women's sports side than on the men's sports side, just with the nature of how those games come together. So I am also partial to watching women's basketball and women's sports. The stories, the type of play, it just resonates more with me.
It's funny too. Like we're big U.S. women's national team fans. Shout out to Sam Coffey and Alyssa Nair, Penn Staters on that team. But I would even say, like, even in the United States, like that's people who are soccer fans, right? They've come to realize that our soccer league here in the United States, the NWSL and the U.S. women's national team, are playing at a much different level than the MLS and our men's national team play at. And so I actually find that to be more entertaining, to be easier to follow. I mean, we follow the men's national team as well. And it's among the most frustrating things in our lives is that men's national team.
Well, the women's national team is, I mean, absolutely incredible in every single way. They're our team, they 4 World Cups at this point. They're just absolutely incredible. Everything they've done and everything they fought for off the field as well. They're just incredible real role models on and off the pitch. So I love the U.S. women's national team. I think a lot of the growth that we're seeing right now in women's sports can be credited to what they've done and what they've built. So they're just such an important piece of this equation.
Caroline, I'm thinking about the where we are today with women's sports and where we have been over history, right? And I think in my lifetime, I think of the Steffi Grafs and the Cheryl Millers. And then in my kind of my generation would have been the Mia Hamms of the world. And my wife and I were season ticket holders for UConn basketball for 4 years when Sue and Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi were there. We were there for Diana's 4 years, which was fantastic.
Wow.
And now you see the Angel Reeses and the Caitlin Clarks and the even like the Alona Mayers of the world, right? And it seems like the traction that women's sports have caught, in the past 5 years has been a lot stronger than some of those others have been able to bring it forward. Certainly the Caitlin Clarks of the world are building on what Diana did and what Cheryl did before her. But why is now the generation that is getting behind this?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons for that. And I'm so happy you asked this question, because I think people need to understand what has happened in the last couple years that have made this moment in time for women's sports not just a moment. This is a movement, and this is absolutely sustainable growth. This isn't just an outlier on a graph. This is going to continue. So I think the first thing is we have to give a lot of credit to Title IX. So I know Title IX was passed 52 years ago, but we now have 5 generations of women and girls who have had the opportunity to participate in sport at every level and see women participate in sport at every level. And that's really, really important. We now have women who have played sports holding decision-making roles in business across the world. And there's a really, really powerful stat that says that 94% of women who hold C-suite positions in the US played sports growing up. So there's a direct connection between leadership and women holding leadership positions and playing sports as girls. So I think the fact that we have had 52 years of Title IX, we're starting to see the fruits of that come to life. So that's really important as number one. Number two is social media. I mentioned that number that 5% of traditional linear media goes to women's sports. For a long time, that number was stuck at 4%. And we didn't see that movement to now of total share going to 15% until we had tools like social media, digital media that came in that allowed women to get more share of voice in this space. So we've been able to take matters into our own hands, for lack of a better term, when it comes to media coverage in women's sports. And as we've been able to grow coverage through these emerging channels, these non-traditional media outlets and media platforms, we've been able to grow women's sports. So I think that's really important. We've also seen a lot of key moments in women's sports driven by social media, things like calling out the discrepancies between the men's and women's weight rooms at the Final Four at March Madness. That is because of social media. The world was able to see what men were receiving in that situation and what women were receiving. And that was a key moment of change in women's sports. So social media is really important. And then, I think the last thing is we have just stacked so many wins in women's sports now that it's really hard to dispute that there is real viability here when it comes to the business opportunity of women's sports. We have seen examples with the Women's World Cup, the Olympics, the WNBA, the NWSL, the U.S. Women's National Team. We have just seen these wins stack up when it comes to viewership, sponsorship, merchandise sales, attendance, everything that you can see, every metric in the sports industry. We have just stacked so many wins that if you look at that list, it's hard to be like, oh, this is just a blip. This isn't something that's sustainable. We have really made an indisputable business case for women's sports at this point. So, I do not think that this train is going to slow down anytime soon.
Yeah, and I would say too that there can be a lot attributed to the strength of the NWSL, the WNBA. There's a new women's hockey league now, the women's professional volleyball league that was just started in the United States. That will give at least media outlets the opportunity to cover sports, women's sports every day, versus waiting every 4 years for the Olympics or every 4 years for a World Cup, where the light gets shined brightly on women's sports, but then it goes away. Then it goes away really quickly. I think that having the opportunity to cover it on a daily basis at a really high level will continue to move that needle.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's women's sports, I'll say they've always been there. There's always been opportunity to cover them, but this whole ecosystem is now starting to work together. And, as we start to bring more money into the space, we're able to do more things like have expansion teams and have expansion leagues, like you mentioned. So, it's all just adding on top of each other. And yeah, this is much more than just a moment in time.
Yeah, we're huge. Speaking of expansion teams, we're huge big sports fans, big WNBA fans, and we moved here from Oregon, and so that Portland is going to be getting one of those teams is pretty exciting. My daughter still lives out there on the West Coast, has an interest in working in sports, and so like that's come on her radar now. So, but yeah, it's the growth and expansion of these leagues that. The new teams in St. Louis and Kansas City in the NWSL. There's a fire that has been sparked and continues to burn. I want to talk a little bit about trends, right? Because trends in sports have been driven by what was happening on the men's side for the longest time. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the recent NWSL decision to basically make with their contracts, right? I think they're eliminating free agency. They're putting the hands of the careers in the hands of the women now, more so than they have ever been.
Yeah, this is a really groundbreaking CBA that's come out with the NWSL. And I think it's going to, end up being kind of a model across the women's sports industry. It's something that the NWSLPA has been working on for a long time. It comes directly from the players themselves. And yeah, it's thinking differently about how CBAs can put together. The elimination of the draft is a really big part of that. So, I think it's pretty groundbreaking stuff, and I'm excited to see how it plays out over the next couple of years.
It'll be interesting to see how that trend affects men's sports, right? Can you imagine the day and age where there's no NFL draft, right? Where every player coming out of college is a free agent. I mean, you wouldn't have I don't know if you remember, but you wouldn't have the situations like the John Elways back in the day, not wanting to play for a team and holding out. And then the Peyton Manning or Eli Manning, one of them did the same thing. Can you imagine players coming out of college just being able to, get into an opportunity where they can select which team they're playing for?
I think this speaks to something bigger that we're able to do in women's sports is since we are very much in startup mode in the women's sports industry, we're able to build the sports industry on the women's sports side of the house differently that it's been built in men's sports. We're just able to be scrappier. We're able to do things differently. Men's sports are really, really institutionalized. There's a lot of things that are just set in stone and they're done the same way year over year over year over year. We haven't really had that luxury in many ways in women's sports. We've had to be really scrappy and we've had to adapt business models time after time, year after year. So, I think that in some ways that's an advantage. We're able to try different things. We're able to see what works, see what sticks. And, men's sports industry should start looking at what's going on with women's sports because we are able to think differently. We're able to be innovative. And I think to your point, we're going to be able to really influence how things are done across the entire sports industry.
Caroline, when you think about the future, right? We've seen, you mentioned the CBA with the NWSL. We've seen some of the pay equity that happened during this most recent World Cup. We've seen changes in even just how like WNBA teams travel, right? When you think about the agenda of gender equity, right? What are the next few agenda items that you are consulting on, that you are pushing for women's sports?
Yeah, so I talked about this earlier, but certainly bringing more brand and sponsorship dollars into women's sports is hugely important. That's a really, really, really big deal. That's one of the core ways that the sports industry has historically been able to generate revenue. And especially for women's sports, if we're not able to have these large media deals that are a big source of revenue for these teams and leagues, sponsorship deals are going to be a really, really important part of the revenue model to keep these leagues growing and keep them sustainable. So I think that's a really big thing. And I've talked about this a lot, but media coverage is just so important. Again, people cannot become fans of something that they're not exposed to. So if we're going to grow women's sports, we have to first and foremost make it easy to become a women's sports fan. And we need to get women's sports on TV, get it in places that people already are. So increasing the media coverage, I really think that's key number one. If we can increase that, I think it's going to trickle into more dollars coming in and then more pay for athletes. So I think that's a big deal. This might be a little bit out there, but one thing I'm really excited about when it comes to gender equity in sports is we're starting now for the first time to see dedicated women's sports facilities being built. So the Kansas City Current, as you mentioned earlier, they have built the first dedicated women's sports stadium in the world. And we're starting to see this trend across colleges in the United States as well, where they're building dedicated practice facilities, training facilities, stadiums, arenas, specifically for their women's sports programs. We're starting to see it in the WNBA as well, as far as training facilities go. So I think this is a really interesting thing to keep an eye on in women's sports. Having dedicated facilities is going to open up a lot of revenue streams for the industry. So that's something, if you're thinking about, what I should watch, what are things that are going to change the landscape of women's sports over the next decade, I think the dedicated facilities thing is going to be a big part of that.
Absolutely. When you can control the advertising in your arena, right? The revenue that generates, from your previous experience. So yeah, it's all, and even, it's even beyond the sports teams, right? There are now women's sports only sports bars out there, which is a fantastic trend as well.
Yeah, that's a really fun trend that's happening across the globe. The first one opened in Portland, Oregon. So there's going to be a lot of women's sports activity going on in Portland in a couple years. There already is. So that they were the first ones. They opened the sports bra. And then from there, it's just trickled again across the globe. We have one in Seattle, one in Long Beach. One is hoping to open in Chicago. There's one in Minnesota. It's just happening all across. I just saw that there's a fundraiser happening for one in Australia. It's all the time creating these dedicated spaces for people to come in and watch women's sports. And some of them, they all have a slightly different business model. Some of them are just women's sports are going to be on, but some of them just are going to put equitable coverage on. So when you walk in, you're going to see men's sports on, but you're going to see women's sports on the same number of TVs. So it just becomes the norm that women's sports are on alongside men's sports. So I think these are really, really cool businesses. There's even in Kent, Ohio, there's a sports coffee shop that opened this year. And they are just a coffee shop that has equitable coverage of men's and women's sports playing. So you can go in, get a cup of coffee and watch your favorite sports, whether that's men's or women's. So these spaces are popping up. And I think it's a pretty neat trend as well.
This is the people of Penn State. I'm Paul Clifford. I'm joined today by Caroline Fitzgerald. She's the CEO and founder of Goals. It's a women's sports consultancy that has grown out of the pandemic and has flourished. And she also has her award-winning podcast, which you can check out. I think we're going to put the information for the podcast down on the bottom of the screen if you're watching this in YouTube. Caroline, at the end of every podcast, we like to have a little bit of fun with some quick hitter questions. So I'm just going to throw some things out to you. and see what's the first thing that come to mind. So first question, what's your favorite coffee mug to drink out of?
Well, I brought it with me today. I'm drinking out of this is a Penn State coffee mug that I bought my first week while I was at Penn State, and I have had it with me every day since. So, it's definitely a top 5. We'll say that.
That's great. I noticed the brand placement, which we appreciate here. So thank you very much.
We're very passionate about good marketing here. So,
what was your favorite class at Penn State?
oh, that's such a great question. I had so many wonderful classes. I don't know if I can pick one. I loved every single class that I took in my women's studies major. I took classes with Dr. Jill Wood, who's still a professor today. I just loved those classes. I hung on every single word. I was just so thirsty for that content. So that was definitely that's a kind of a cheat way to get out of that answer, is saying I loved my whole major. But I will say on the business side, Dr. Coupland's classes, we talked a lot about branding and consumer packaging. So those are my favorites. My entire women's studies major, and then Dr. Jennifer Coupland.
That's great. What has been your favorite Penn State moment? If you think back to your experience or to some of the things that you experienced here, I know you said you're involved with Thon, you're big into Penn State athletics. What is that quintessential Penn State moment for you?
Honestly, for me, it was the little moments in the everyday. There's so many big moments I could point to. There truly are, but for me, I felt so at home at Penn State, and I think it was largely because of the job that I had at the Center for their Gender Equity Center. That was really my home away from home at Penn State, and I got to work with the most amazing women, Dr. Peggy Laura, Susan Del Ponte, and Dr. Audra Hickson, and the work that they did was just so powerful. And a lot of my family also worked there as well. So it was the place that I went and got to see my siblings during the busy days at Penn State. So yeah, I feel like I'm giving you bad answers to these questions, or I'm not following the rules. But for me, when I think back on my Penn State experience, my favorite moments are when I was in the center with my siblings, with the faculty and staff there. And it just meant a lot to me.
Well, they're not bad answers, right? It's all the classes and all the moments, right? What sells Penn State better than everything you touch is going to be your favorite?
I mean, yeah, it's all good.
Absolutely. How about on your podcast, your favorite interview thus far?
This is an easy one. It's my first interview. So the first interview I ever did was with a woman named Eb Jones. And I knew the first story that I wanted to tell on the podcast was the story of the WNBA orange hoodie. So you've probably seen the hoodie out there, but the orange hoodie really started this moment, not even a moment, a movement rather, around supporting the WNBA. We saw a lot of professional male athletes and female athletes starting to wear this hoodie to bring awareness to the WNBA. And, it just spoke to the power of a piece of merchandise to sparking this interest in women's sports. And I was just fascinated by this. And so I really wanted to tell this story. So I didn't know who was responsible for it or what it was. And I went to Twitter and I just posed the question across the goals channels and said, I'd like to tell the story of the WNBA orange hoodie. Who should I talk to? And all these people flooded my inbox, flooded the comments and said, you have to talk to Eb Jones. You have to talk to Eb. And so Eb had never been asked to tell the story of the orange hoodie. I was the first one. And she took a chance on me, an unknown podcaster, and said, I'm going to tell you the story. You're going to be the first one to hear it. And we're going to break it on your podcast. So she put a lot of faith in me. And she told the story, and it's absolutely incredible. Everybody needs to go listen to it. But she talks about how she had a $0 marketing budget, created this campaign. She tells the story of how Kobe Bryant was in the WNBA office, and she literally ran out and said, here are sweatshirts for you and your whole family. And then a week later, he showed up wearing it courtside at the WNBA All-Star game. Like the stories she told around it are absolutely incredible. I just sat there listening to her, like, oh my gosh, listening the whole time. So, I think it speaks to the power of individuals in women's sports. It talks about, this movement and the power of merchandise and the power of community. I just think it's the most perfect podcast episode ever. And I was not a great interviewer at the time. I did the best I could. It was my first one, but it's a really, really special episode.
How about if you could have dinner with anyone, who would it be and why?
It would be Billie Jean King. And it's because Billie Jean King really has done so much for women's sports and for women in general. My goodness. If we didn't have Billie Jean King, I'm not sure where the women's sports industry would be today. A lot of the great stuff that we see and that we have today in women's sports is attributed to the work that Billie Jean did. So Billie Jean is my dream lunch date and also podcast guest. So Billie, if you're listening, you have an open invitation to come on the podcast.
Where would you take her in Pittsburgh?
We'd probably go to Permane Brothers.
Permane Brothers, like the original in the Strip District?
Yeah, you got to give Billie the whole Pittsburgh experience. Yeah. So we'd probably go to Permane Brothers and have the loaded sandwiches with French fries and coleslaw and the whole 9 yards.
That's great. How about your most unusual "We Are" moment? Either a place where you saw a Penn Stater and you yelled out "We Are," or you were somewhere and it caught you by surprise.
That's a really good question. When I moved to Milwaukee, I wasn't expecting to see any Penn Staters while I was there in Badger country, but there were Penn Staters there, and that made me feel right at home being in a new city. So I remember seeing my first Penn State shirt while I was in Wisconsin, and it was a really nice feeling.
That's great. All right, you mentioned you were a Lion ambassador. What was your fun fact on your tour?
I cannot remember. I usually use my fun fact as 8 kids that have gone to Penn State are talking about that in some way. But I can't remember. That's a tough one.
Right.
You're taking me back to my tour guide days.
How about your favorite Penn State sport?
I mean, I've talked about women's basketball for sure. Women's volleyball, my goodness. That was so fun to see even 12 years ago when I was at Penn State and the women's volleyball team playing in Rec Hall and absolutely selling out and having a dedicated fan base. So big fan of the volleyball team, but yeah, I will always probably come back to basketball because that's where my roots are.
Great. And how about your favorite flavor of creamery ice cream?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this differently. My favorite thing that you can purchase at the creamery are actually chunks of creamery cheese. When I go into the creamery, I go into the fridge and they have like chunks of cheese that didn't make the cut of like beautiful slices. And you can buy chunks of cheese for like 60 cents, or you could whenever I was there. And they are incredible. So that's when I went into the creamery, I was going for the cheese scraps. And
all right, you are the first person to mention cheese as an answer to that question. So groundbreaker there.
Yeah, creamery ice cream is delicious. Don't get me wrong, but creamery cheese, my goodness.
Well, Caroline, we want to thank you for joining us on the podcast and for allowing us to share your story. It's when Penn Staters like you allow us to share their story with others that swells thy fame of dear old state. And for that, we're truly grateful.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And we are
Penn State. I want to thank our producer, Vincent Longaro, our guest relations coordinator, Abby Clark, for all they do behind the scenes. If you like this episode, I hope that you'll subscribe to the People of Penn State podcast in your favorite podcast app of choice. And while you're there, go ahead, give us a like, give us a rating, drop a review. It helps other Penn Staters find these great stories. If you're a member of the Alumni Association, thank you for your support. Your support directly helps us put together great programs like the People of Penn State podcast and the many other things that you enjoy about the Alumni Association. And if you're not a member, What are you waiting for? Go to our website at alumni.psu.edu, and you too can become a member of the world's largest alumni association. Thanks for all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are